Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. I'd like to remind the viewers that this program now is being live streamed at 12 noon Eastern Time. But good to have you with us today, and Daniel, good to have you back with us.
Thank you, sir.
Good. I'd like to visit with you and our audience about the subject of these war games going on. Major war games going on by NATO. And NATO is very, very fearful. You know, they're seeing the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. They essentially have Russia surrounded. They have 6 command posts around Russia. We have Navy all over the place. And of course, there's been the antagonism of Ukraine. But now, the largest ever war games, anti-submarine war games are going on right now in the Baltic Sea and very, very close to the Baltics. And of course, it's to protect them against this potential and imminent invasion of the Russians, which I think there's a bit of hype there. It's also been claimed that it's done for our national interest. And I keep wondering, 6,000 miles away from home, and we have to send the ships over there for our national interest. So I guess you've been following this. What do you think what's going on there, really?
Well, this latest is just one in a number of increased NATO exercises close to Russia's borders. I think the Russian General Staff said there's an increase of 80% in the last year of NATO exercises near Russia. And it's funny, in the one in the Baltics, that as the destroyer steamed into the Baltic Sea, the Navy had a press release saying, it's arrived to promote peace and stability.
Right.
It's hard to see how you promote stability in this manner.
Well, you know, we're sending a guided missile destroyer there. That sounds like a pretty hefty vessel that's in their USS Jason Dunham. And it's going to be involved, but it's generally stationed in Virginia. But now they're on maneuvers, routine maneuvers over there in the Baltic Seas. From my viewpoint, it just looks like we're looking for trouble. It's so hard for me to understand how we get off on these tangents. And the more I've studied history, the more I wonder why the people allow their governments to drive them into these war conditions, even as far back as Civil War times, especially World War I and World War II. You know, how presidents maneuver us into war, and you could look at every one of them, whether it's Korea or Vietnam, and what's going on in the Middle East today. What are the current conditions right now that motivate some of these politicians who are not serving our interests?
Well, one thing is, I think, useful to remember is that this latest escalation and most serious escalation of bad relations between the U.S. and Russia, or NATO and Russia, started back last year when there was civil unrest in Ukraine, which is not a NATO member and does not have the Article 5 protection of the NATO countries. Civil unrest that was encouraged by the U.S., who wanted to overthrow the government, and they succeeded. And that led to, as it does everywhere the U.S. intervenes, it led to chaos and a civil war. And so the civil war on Russia's border, which would make us nervous, of course, if it was Mexico, it made Russia very nervous. You know, Russia has paid close attention. But NATO then has used this as an excuse now to ramp up its military.
And sometimes they make up these stories, because not too long ago, several weeks ago, the Russians were accused of having a submarine in the Baltic, and there was excitement, and they had to call our Navy out to check it out. That really wasn't a very dangerous situation, was it?
Yeah, that was last autumn in Sweden. There was the whole country was on alert looking for this submarine off the coast of Sweden. And then actually a Swedish rear admiral said a little bit later on Swedish television that actually that wasn't really a sub, it was a workboat now that we looked at it. But what is interesting, and this goes to what you were asking earlier, the Swedish government has used this as justification to increase their defense budget to $696 million between 2016 and 2020. So there's a big payoff for a phony threat.
You mean there are more than one country, more than us, who have a military-industrial complex? Maybe they're catching on. Maybe that's the way they think that's the road to prosperity. But someday they're going to wake up and they're going to realize that this warmongering is a road to poverty. The position that we take, our government takes, that we have made a firm commitment to stay in Eastern Europe. and that's what NATO is all about. But they can't stay unless we have an enemy. And just like we had to have an enemy in Iraq, and they're about to attack us, and of course Al-Qaeda was in Iraq, you know, and we had to go in. And everything we seem to do seems to either create the problems we were pretending we were going after, or if there was a little bit of a problem, it just blows it out of proportion. And I can't see anything else other than that happening from us going over there and antagonizing Russia right now.
Well, it's not even just, it's increasing our presence in Eastern Europe and moving closer. You know, it was just a month or so ago that the U.S. had major military equipment just 300 yards from the Russian border. That's just 3 football fields from the Russian border. You can imagine if the shoe was on the other foot and we were in this situation.
But what about NATO's rapid deployment force? You know, I mean, I don't think that's what was intended to have the world police run by us under NATO, but that essentially looks like it is what we have there. There's been 13,000, but they're getting ready to increase that, I believe.
30,000. They're going to put it up to 30,000.
is rapid deployment, and who knows, the danger is that they might use them.
And if there is if there were a Russian invasion, what would 30,000 troops achieve anyway? It's,
Besides, they don't resort to that anyway. They depend on bombs and missiles and cruise missiles and drones and everything else.
The other thing I think is that this ramping up this huge threat justifies, of course, more spending. Poland is going to spend $5 billion on Patriot missiles made by Raytheon.
Yeah.
But I think ramping this up does serve that interest. But it also, I think, takes attention away from places where NATO has intervened that have not turned out so well. Look at Libya today. Look at even Yugoslavia, how many years later?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that they always call these war games.
Yeah.
But sometimes these war games end up, with real war. But, you know, there are some other things I think motivates some of these individuals to get involved and promote this, and it's financial. And this is a little more complex. It's not mentioned a whole lot in the media, but I think we certainly talked a little bit about this when we were going into Iraq. The threat the Iraqis won't take our dollars anymore. That we punish Iran because they wanted to get out of the dollar, and Libya was accused of the same thing, and it may well be true. But what about right now? You know that there is an Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they're trying to start their own IMF, and they're getting a lot of support. Now, all this military aggravation that we're committing has another financial effect. Other than just the military making more money, this pushes these people away. Just think how we have pushed everybody toward China and India and Russia. They're all going in this direction, not only superficially, but like who's owning the gold these days and who's likely to have the next reserve currency. And so our policies in Iraq, they were not friends with Iran. Everybody hated Iran, and we want to punish it. So we get rid of the government, introduce Al-Qaeda, total chaos, and the country's more in line with Iran than ever before. Now, I suspect what's going to come of this now, as the more we aggravate the Russians, the more they're going to push the need for out of defense, not the military defense, but financial defense, because we put these unrealistic sanctions on Russia. So what should they do? You know, I mean, they haven't attacked anybody. The Iranians haven't attacked anybody, and yet we're doing everything to drive them down and punish them.
Of course, they would say the Russians have attacked. They took Crimea, you know, and this sort of thing. But if you look at the referendum there, and you know, we always say we support democracy. But, you know, and I wonder about this back on the international financial. I think it's an interesting point because, you know, as much as our allies mouth their support for us, what happened when they announced this new Asian bank? Weren't we begging our allies to not join it? And
you know, some of our allies that are closer to us than people realize, they want to go possibly. They're keeping the door open to maybe go with the IMF, which means that this is a challenge to the dollar. And right now, the dollar has been taking some hits. I mean, it's lost approximately 5% in the last couple weeks, and that's huge. And if that continues that trend, there may be that panic out of the dollar, which will come. Right now, the drop in the dollar is a drop in relationship to other currencies, which is not quite as big a deal because that's all ups and downs. But the real problem is when they reject the dollar and prices go up in dollar terms. But, you know, oil went down to 40, now it's over 60. So there may be getting some adjustments there as well. But, you know, I still go back to the comparison that I frequently have made over the years, and that is, what if they did to us what we do to them? Let's say that we get a little weaker, or even if we're not weaker, but the Russians and the Chinese want to exert their international laws, rights, to have an exercise, a war games in the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow.
Can you imagine what would happen? There'd be no way. I mean, there'd be nuclear weapons in no time. But that's essentially, whether we're in the Persian Gulf, we own the Persian Gulf. Now we own the Baltic Sea, and everybody's supposed to say, "Oh, welcome, we love you. I know you're going to take care of us, and we'll get foreign aid from you, and you won't take advantage of us." But nobody wants to hear about that comparison. Say, "Oh no, well, they might want to, but we wouldn't let them do that." Well, someday we have to develop a more coherent foreign policy, and that's been my goal, a policy which says that we have a right to defend ourselves. We don't have the moral right to start wars. We should not be aggressors. We should not do preemptive war, and we shouldn't go and attack countries that are stereotyped unfairly. I mean, here, Iran has its problems, believe me, and I wouldn't want to live there or defend them, but when's the last time they invaded a country?
Yeah, it's been, I think, 200 years or so.
200 years ago, and I don't think the Russians are dumb enough to move tanks into Eastern Europe. That's not going to happen. Anyway, I want to thank the audience for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and remember, this is live streamed at 12 noon Eastern Time. Thanks for listening.